Hello and welcome to podcast number 33, Naturally Scott. I'm Scott Harris, your host, and today's guest is Chris Parish. Chris is president and CEO of the Peregrine Fund. I think you will find the conversation fascinating. One of the things I discovered is their focus is not, they certainly focus on peregrine falcons, but not to the exclusivity of others. And so that was kind of neat for me to find out. They're known for peregrines, but actually they work with over 100 different raptor species in 65 countries. But we talk a lot about condors. Chris has some background in condors, spent years managing and studying condors, and I learned a lot about that. It's one of the themes that comes up in quite a few of the podcasts are California Condors. People do seem to love them and be fascinated. I almost lost them and they came back, and DDT and lead and all of those things. We talk about, Chris is an angler, not a fisherman, but an angler and a hunter, and we talk about that and how compatible that is with what he's doing. And we talk about the challenges of conservation in kind of a jaded and an apathetic world and some of the things that he has to deal with. Overall, I think you'll find it to be a fascinating hour. Chris is a fascinating guy, and if nothing else, you'll learn a bit about him playing defensive line in football. So I think you'll enjoy it. Have a great day. Enjoy the podcast. Thank you as always, and stay curious. Hello, and welcome to this edition of Naturally Scott. I'm Scott Harris. I'm your host. Excited and proud to be your host, as I always am. I'm just thrilled with the guests that we bring in. And today's guest I'm really excited about, Chris Parish, who is the president and CEO of the Peregrine Fund. For regular viewers, regular audience of this show, you know that my passion is raptors. So having a guy on board who's made his living with raptors is a pretty cool deal to me. So I'm really excited about this. But before we get to the Peregrine Fund, I want to back up to the San Joaquin Valley. Chris, you were raised in the San Joaquin Valley as a football player, a hunter, and as I've learned, an angler, not a fisherman. So tell us a little bit about what that was like.
Oh, you bet. Well, I think, I didn't realize it was any different from anybody else. I thought everybody hunted and fished. And when I say angler, I guess it's, everything from saltwater off the coast of California to fishing in a canal bank from an old back pump from a reservoir that was used to irrigate the almond orchards. I mean, if it had water and it had fish or it had any other kind of critters that were in season, we were out there chasing them on the weekends and the afternoons. Outside of football season, of course, which was my big hope to get out of the valley and get a football scholarship and, of course, make it to the NFL, which didn't all pan out.
But
I did. I made it as far as...
Go ahead.
Yeah, I made it as far as the European League after I was told I should probably hang it up for health purposes. And, I knew best for me, of course. And so I went and played one game in between NFL Europe and the European and World League in Germany. And that's when I decided that, maybe the creature comforts of home and not having that athletic trainer who was there after every game to help nurse me back to health for the next, maybe they were right. And it was time to move on. And that's when I moved on and went to work directly for the Arizona Game and Fish Department. And that's where I started my career in Arizona.
Okay. But before you did that, you did play some football, Bakersfield Community College?
Yes, sir. I played at BC under two of the best years. We were undefeated in league both years, and we opened the second season with Navarro, Texas, who was I forget what it was. There's JC Gridwire and there was USA Today, and we were ranked number one in one, and they were ranked number one in the other. And the start of my sophomore year, we opened up the season with a game with them from Texas, and we prevailed, so that was nice. But I like to remind people that football in Bakersfield is very, very similar to football in Texas. It's a big deal. And, for me, it was a ticket to the next level, which was to get an education. And for me, it was either that or go work in the oil patch or the farm fields, and I chose the football route.
Well, good for you. And that route took you to Northern Arizona University, where you studied fish and wildlife biology.
I did. I started in forestry. And again, just a, know-nothing kid from the valley figured, well, I knew what the deserts were like. I want to see about forests. And so maybe I'll look into forestry. And luckily, I had enough years ahead of me at NAU that I started in forestry program. I was really intrigued by fish and wildlife management. I didn't know that there was a whole world of fish and wildlife management through agencies and nonprofits that worked in biology, which is the better understanding of fish and wildlife and their ecosystems. And, that was naturally I was drawn to that naturally because I always tell people that I became a biologist probably in a self-serving way to be a better hunter and angler. And in the end, I realized that the conservation side of fish and wildlife management was really where my passion was because I wanted those opportunities for future generations like I had had. And that's what really cemented it for me.
Backing up though, did it teach you to become a better fisherman or a better angler and hunter?
Of course. Of course. It
Knowledge is
feels
power, right?
it feels a little, yeah, yeah. I just got a shirt from one of my buddies. I did a podcast with Pope and Young, and there's a young man named Dylan who runs their podcast, and he said, "God, I love talking to guys like you and their new executive director, Justin Spring, because you guys you're all out there hunting and fishing, and so you're normal in that way. But you guys know things. You're like redneck nerds." And I said, "Well, knowledge is deadly." And now they have a shirt that says "Redneck Nerd, Knowledge is Deadly." So there's an
I
angle
kind of
for you.
like that. I like that. I think that's a good shirt. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah,
So you left northern Arizona and went to work for Arizona Game and Fish.
that's correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And what did you do as a wildlife biologist?
Oh man. Well, again, I was limited because I didn't have all those really cool internships in my 4 years or 5 years at the university because my primary objective was to keep my scholarship and make sure I was going to play. And so that's what I focused on. So when I went to Arizona Game and Fish, I basically walked in the front door and I had met some people through the wildlife management classes, et cetera. But I walked in the front door and said, I need a job and I'm very handy with my hands. I could communicate with people. I have a degree with an emphasis in fish and wildlife management. What do you need done around here that I can do? And I would have done anything.
And I can
And that
knock the left guard on his butt.
that's right. That's right. And so there was a lot of encouragement for me to go in and become a wildlife manager, a law enforcement officer, but that really wasn't my shtick. That wasn't what I wanted to do. So my first job was to trap prairie dogs for the black-footed ferret reintroduction program because they were whelping these kits. They had breeding pairs in these exclosures out in the middle of the Aubrey Valley west of Flagstaff, and they wanted to have live prairie dogs, which is their primary quarry, and wanted to have those prairie dogs so that those young kits that were being whelped in there would have that experience of learning to hunt with their parents. And so my response was, sure, what do those look like again? And I went to trapping. And I trapped, I think I trapped near 600 of those prairie dogs over that summer. And I created a quarantine program because plague is a big issue with prairie dogs and can devastate a prairie dog community and therefore any of the predators within that same community. So I created a quarantine system and trapped prairie dogs, and then that led to they needed 25 samples from coyotes in the region for canine distemper. And again, for a kid like me to say, well, can you go shoot some coyotes for us? And I'd grown up doing that and predator calling, etc. And when they said, I said, wait, let me get this clear. You want me to go hunt coyotes and you're going to pay me for it and trap critters? And yes, I'm all in. So I became a utility guy, just like I was in football, playing both sides of offensive, defensive line and any position within. I continued that tradition of being a utility guy, and man, they found value in it and they moved me around. The last position they moved me into before I met the Peregrine Fund was the California Condor Recovery Program coordinator for the state. So they'd had a gentleman leave that position and they detailed me into that, which was a full-time position. So for a biologist starting out, that was a dream job to get a secure position that was at least on an annual basis was secure. And that's when I met the Peregrine Fund.
Okay. So, and tell us a little bit about your work with the Condors, and then we'll move into the Peregrine Fund.
You bet. Well, as you know, as maybe some of your listeners may not know, the California Condors were down to 22 individuals. And this was known to us, in the valley. I grew up and got to see those last few condors while working on a ranch in a summer job in high school. And so I knew the history of the condor. But the history that I knew of the condor was from that local perspective. And that was primarily, it was an endangered species. And if you had an endangered species in your community, from the perspective of the community, it meant nothing good. It meant that it had the potential to impact your way of life, your cattle grazing allotment, your ability to till the fields if you were a farmer. That's the side of the condor that I knew as a kid. And then now I'm in my professional career and I knew they were trying to reintroduce them. And I thought, well, maybe I can learn all there is to learn about the biology and the natural history of the condor. And maybe I can communicate that if I understand what the problems are to the local communities, and we can have a successful recovery effort. And that was just an eye-opening, eyes wide open experience for me to understand what it meant to reintroduce, well, to first breed them in captivity. We had to breed them in captivity successfully. And so we had done that. The LA Zoo and the San Diego Wild Animal Park, they had a very successful captive breeding program that led to the opportunity to be able to reintroduce birds first in California in 1992 and then followed up in 1996 in Arizona. So I came on in February of 97 as a biologist for the state, a couple of months after the first 6 birds were reintroduced in northern Arizona at the Vermilion Cliffs. And so that was the beginning. And trying to pull all of that which I had grown up with into perspective of what does it take to reintroduce an endangered species and recover them? Well, first you have to save them from extinction, which that was done through captive breeding. And then by releasing birds into the wild and monitoring them extensively, determine what the problems were. Why were they not surviving? There was a lot of supposition in the 40 years that led up to that point in time. And by studying the birds intensively, we could then come to understand why they were succeeding or not. And that began the journey of my role in raptor recovery, of what it truly meant to study a species to the hilt. I mean, we had VHF and GPS transmitters on every bird. So when I came on, we tracked those first 6 birds, one person per bird, and we knew everything they did from sunrise to sunset.
Now they travel long distances, right? I mean, they can travel tens of miles in a day, even up to 100 miles, if I understand correctly.
Absolutely. In the early stages of the recovery effort, the birds were rather sedentary, which makes sense because, one, they're young birds. They don't have any parents out there to model their behavior after or to follow around. And we saw that they were pretty sedentary. But what we've come to learn now, almost 30 years later, is that these birds that we're releasing into an existing healthy population, relatively speaking, they can travel as much as 50 to 70 miles in their first trip away from the release site, which adds a whole new challenge to the game of tracking them and keeping track of them in a place like the Grand Canyon ecoregion, which includes this Grand Canyon proper, Zion National Park, Bryce, and all that country in the Arizona Strip. So basically, I was turned loose as a biologist with a fuel card and a pickup truck and some telemetry equipment and spotting scope and binoculars, and go up there and get with the Peregrine Fund and go track these birds and represent us and tell us what you learned. So it was phenomenal position.
That's fantastic. Now, as I understand it, the biggest challenge still facing the condors is.
Yes, and that wasn't immediately apparent, even from the reintroductions in California and the study of the birds up until the point of reintroduction. Lead was known to be a problem, and when we say that, we should jump straight into how is it a problem? Well, animals that we put down or hunt, and this could be a wounded cow on the landscape or a wounded wildlife, a wounded ungulate like a deer or an elk that's hit on the road. An officer or somebody from Department of Transportation might dispatch that animal, shoot it and put it out of its misery, and then leave it on the side of the road. It may also be that animals that we normally hunt legally, like coyotes or deer or elk, the remains of those animals that we shoot and leave in the field, they contain lead. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because we didn't know where the lead was coming from, and we didn't see lead poisoning and lead-caused mortality until about 2002. We had our first lead death in the summer of 2000, which was an anomaly. But that piqued our interest that we should test the birds' blood for lead throughout the year to see if there's any peak of exposure. And what we found by 2002 is we saw a peak of exposure, and it coincided with our deer hunt on the Kaibab Plateau. So again, being a hunter, a lifelong hunter, I thought, well, how much lead can there be out there? And so the first assumption was maybe it's wounding loss, animals that are wounded, or previously discussed, if an animal's put down and you shoot it in the head and leave it in the field, how much lead is in the resulting carcass from a wounding loss animal that's not recovered or an animal that's dispatched. And that led to our first fragmentation study. And this, again, for a young biologist, we're going to go out and shoot deer and x-ray them to quantify how much bullets fragment and therefore how many fragments are left in the remains in the gut pile that we would leave a field. And that study, with under the direction of Bill Burnham, our president at the time, and Granger Hunt, who is our chief scientist, we devised a very simple study where under two experiments, we went and shot 30 deer each, and I think we ended up with 64 total. And we x-rayed these animals whole. Then we took the gut piles and x-rayed the gut piles all the way down to the packaged meat. So we quantified fragmentation under standard hunting situations with standard hunting ammunition from 243 all the way up to 300 Win Mag, usually inside of 200 yards. And we got to see what blew our minds, that the average was a couple hundred fragments in each carcass that we had shot. And then as you break that carcass down, the different amounts of fragments in each compartment, like the gut pile, all the way down to the packaged meat, we had a study and we had quantified it. So it was eye-opening for us as hunting biologists. And then we took that information to the Arizona Game and Fish Department, our partner in the recovery effort, and said, we've stumbled onto something that's been right under our nose. And that is every animal that's harvested with lead has the potential to leave fragments of lead in the gut piles that are consumed by scavenging wildlife like condors and eagles and ravens, etc. And so that opened it up. And I want to reiterate that that was the most important step. Notice I didn't say, once we found the source of lead, we went out and threatened to sue people. The Peregrine Fund has celebrated our 55th year this year, and we've never sued anybody. That's not what we do for conservation. We understand the system through our scientific studies. We identify potential solutions, and then we go to work with our stakeholders to try and solve that problem. So that whole study resulted in a voluntary education and incentive-based program to, one, share the information with our fellow hunters. Number two, ask them if they wouldn't mind taking efforts to reduce that lead by shooting lead-free ammunition that is no cost to them, or incentivizing bagging up those gut piles and removing them from the landscape. And it has resulted in 87% annual participation for over a decade from those deer hunters on the Kaibab Plateau, and a few bison hunters as well. And so this was not only, my first scientific study where I was a co-author, which is what you aspire to do when you're in school for wildlife management, but it also led to a very successful, proactive, on-the-ground campaign to reduce the number one threat, which is lead poisoning and condors, and it's working. So that inspired us to move forward in 2018 to launch the North American Lead-Free Partnership to share this story across the nation and beyond.
So just to back up and make sure I understand, the original study that you worked on, you did that as a member of the Peregrine Fund?
No, yes. Yeah, in 2000, I skipped over that. My apologies. I left the Arizona Game and Fish.
I wasn't sure where the bridge was.
You bet. Well, in my mind, it's funny. They're all the same, right? I mean, sure, there's a different place that your income is coming from. But yes, I joined the Peregrine Fund to direct the Condor Recovery Program in 2000, November of 2000.
Okay.
Yeah, that was an important detail.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I just, so that being said, and it sounds like we're making some progress, what is the downside? What would be the pushback from a hunter saying, no, I'm going to continue to use lead? I mean, what is the motivation for that?
Number one, Scott, is that we don't like change. We as humans do not like change. It is really that simple, because you think about it, with all the anticipation leading up to a hunting season, and I don't care whether it's dove hunting, quail hunting, grouse hunting, deer hunting, elk hunting, moose hunting, whatever. What you're likely to do is what you have done and the generations before you have done. because the last time you had success, or anybody in your family or your hunting party, you want to know exactly what they used, how they used it, where they were. I mean, to the point on the earth where they were. We do what we do because of our successes previously. It's only with new knowledge that we modify that behavior. And new knowledge in the form of, hey, this is a good thing for conservation. I'm sorry, what ranks highest in a hunter or an angler's mind is what worked last time. And so you're not likely to change. And I'm a relatively simple thinker. I think in my mind it's as simple as saying, why wouldn't Grandpa ever be caught dead driving a Dodge or a Chevy or a Ford? Right? It's not because they don't work. It's because they do what we do because it's what we do. So that's not an answer that leads you to, well, what's the solution? But you really have to start there. And so tradition, sometimes multi-generationally held traditions, are the things that you have to change with new information. And the way in which you go about it has more to do with your success than the scientific truth or the evidence that's out there. And I tell a lot of scientists, young scientists that I'm working with who are considering going into conservation, you can do science and you can know the truth of today, right? With the repeatable science. But in this day and
Right.
age, people don't care about the science. And for that matter, science has been vilified, because what the lay people see is a PhD scientist on this side of the argument and a PhD scientist on this side. And it leaves the common person to think that they don't know what the hell's going on. So this goes back to our strategy and how we inform our strategy. Our strategy is taking very simple findings and incorporating that into our knowledge base as a society and beginning to inspire change that makes for a better end product. And that is our ability to hunt into the future and to do it in a manner that is respectful of the critters and respectful of our new knowledge. And so that really is the game of conservation to me.
So you're trying to change tradition through education.
That's right.
Okay. So what was the next project after the Condor project?
Well, for me, in my career, I managed the Condor Recovery Program for about 18 years and
Oh my, okay.
ended up going back to graduate school at NAU and working on a PhD there. And then we launched the North American Lead-Free Partnership in 2018. And then I became the conservation director for the Peregrine Fund, which broadened my plate of responsibilities in about the same time, 2018, 2019. And then in 2021, I stepped into the role of president and CEO. For me personally and the different species that I worked with, when I became conservation director, I began working more with our Aplomado falcon recovery program in South Texas. We did some work that I participated
Thank you
in
for
with
that, by the way. I've seen them a number of times on trips down there. They are stunning birds.
They are beautiful falcons, and great story there too. So I would say for my personal journey in my career, it was Condors through the non-lead partnership. Now we call it the lead-free partnership at the urging of some of our stakeholders. And then Aplomado Falcons, Golden Eagles. And then I spent some time in India and I've done a survey in Africa, beginning to branch out there. I helped out a bit with the Asian vulture crisis in India. And that was a really neat story about how a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory called diclofenac that here in the States we use as an anti-inflammatory in people. They were using it, they being the societies there, to inject into their cattle when their cattle were sick and in pain, because they don't euthanize their critters there because of their religious beliefs about cattle. Well, they would inject their cattle with this NSAID and the cattle would die, and not because they were injected with it, but it's their natural course. They were on their way out, so they wanted to ease their pain. They gave them a shot of this NSAID, and then if the animals eventually died, they went to the skinners, and the skinners would take the hides just as they've done for thousands of years, and then the carcasses would be left to field for the vultures to come in and clean up. And so there's a huge service to society that these scavengers had come to do to clean up those carcasses. Well, if they consumed, any of those vulture species consumed diclofenac in those cattle, they would die 72 hours later. So it resulted in breeding colonies of 30,000 birds there and healthy 1 year, and absolutely gone, completely gone the next year, which led to an increase in carrion rotting on the landscape, which led to an increase in feral dog populations, which led to an increased occurrence of rabies in humans because of attacks from feral dogs. So therein lies another, why do we do what we do? They did it because it was tradition. They had a new piece of scientific evidence that in diclofenac they could ease the pain of their cattle, and so they adopted that and used it. But what they didn't know is that was had deleterious effects and could cause harm to the vulture populations, which resulted in an influx of rabies. So it's said that the Indian government spent billions of dollars responding to rabies cases, and because of the human impact that it had, because of this little bauble in the course of the life natural history of a scavenger and the role that they've come to play on the landscape that actually benefits us. So that was an eye-opening experience, and I began to see then that now with that experience in India and my experiences in Africa with understanding the retaliatory poisoning in Africa, that again, herdsmen, people of the land in those pastoralist communities, when they have a predator come in and it kills one of their cows, what do you do but revert back to protecting your stock? So they would enlist the support of somebody who'd come in and poison a carcass. And that carcass that was poisoned would not only kill the predator, which was targeted because that's the one that took their cattle, but it also had the potential to poison hundreds of other, even thousands of other species of scavenging wildlife that would feed on that poisoned carcass. So we developed a program there in the Masai Mara in Kenya, just south of Nairobi. We developed a program to share that, hey, there are other ways with the local community there. There are other ways we can help protect your cattle. So if you have a predation where a hyena or a lion comes in and kills your cattle, call us. We'll come in and help you fortify your boma, which is basically the pen that they keep them in overnight. And we will help you haze away that predator and protect your livestock, and thereby protect the species that might otherwise be harmed and poisoned like the vultures there. So there's 3 cases from lead, diclofenac, and retaliatory poisoning where new knowledge found the source of the potential problem with scavenging wildlife and predatory wildlife. And we had to come up with novel solutions for each of those different cases, like finding an alternative drug that can be used that doesn't have that negative effect on scavenging wildlife, or increasing and fortifying their bomas by electrifying their bomas to have an electric fence around their cattle at night so they don't get taken, or finding lead-free ammunition, or removing the remains of lead-shot animals from the field. These are the creative solutions that through education and incentivization, we can come to the positive outcome for humans and for wildlife. The system of conservation everywhere. There's usually a human-derived component in there that has an unintended impact that through education and changing the ways we operate can avoid that negative impact that wasn't intended in the first place. That's our conservation biology system.
Well, that's a fantastic system. I was in the Masai Mara last year and saw some of those bomas and had a chance to talk to some of the locals there about some of these issues, and it is amazing the trickle down theory, where the completely unintended consequences of an action that we take get out there. I want to ask you, Chris. I published a book a couple years ago called Raptor Quest, Chasing America's Raptors. And I spent 17 months and chased all of the 53 raptors that are in the lower 48 states and managed to get on every one of them, by the way. So you've talked a lot about vultures, and I'm a huge fan of vultures. I think it's arguable that the black and the turkey might be our most valuable birds for the carrion cleanup they do and the disease prevention or reduction and all of those things. But after I spent all this time doing this, I came to believe that maybe vultures are not really raptors. And I realize I've stepped into a pile there, and there are people on both sides of that fence. But I'm curious what your thought is. I mean, is a turkey vulture, is a California condor, is a black, are those, in your mind, are they raptors?
So with today's science and the extensive review of what makes a raptor, by today's definition, they are. but I understand what you're saying. That when before Jurassic Park, or before the Ford pickup truck, both of which had raptors in them, right, in their name, before that, a raptor to me was a predator, right? But then again, as I studied even in my undergrad, you start looking at the natural history and behavior of a shrike or a roadrunner or a great blue heron. Are they not predators? So what's different about them? And so I have for me personally, I have like I do with a lot of heavier sciences, I've kind of thrown up my hands and said, well, wait a second. What seemed like a raptor to me wasn't based on as many points of data as the debate is today. And I defer to the scientists, one of which is on our staff, Dr. Chris McClure, who has published a wonderful paper about basically defining what a raptor is and what it is not. And I'll defer to them. But I get what you're saying, that fundamentally for me, a raptor is like a peregrine falcon or a golden eagle. And I would
Yep.
argue that half of the life or three-quarters of the life of an annual cycle of a bald eagle, it's more of a scavenger than it is a predator when you compare it to a golden eagle. So I get what you're saying,
Right.
but hell, now it's all encumbered by, when you say raptor in a classroom today, depending on the generation you're talking to, they're going to think dinosaur. Or if
Yes.
depending on the community, they're going to think the pickup truck, the Ford Raptor.
Yep.
So
Yep. Well, and it's interesting because if you talk about corvids or woodpeckers or hummingbirds, there are scientifically generally accepted definitions of what
yeah,
those are. And it is ongoing with regards to raptors and birds of prey. There's not a generally accepted. And when I lecture on this, I use this example. Back in 1964, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart was asked to define pornography. And he said, well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And I think
there you go.
I think that fits for raptors. And when I'm giving my regular lecture on this, the first example I bring up is the loggerhead shrike, which, if you were to compare a turkey vulture with a shrike, which do you think is closer to what the average person thinks a raptor is?
Right.
This
Yeah.
vicious little bird that impales lizards on fence posts and twigs and barbed wire, or a bird that's never captured anything live. And in the case of a turkey, it needs a black to open the carcass so it can. And by the way, again, I never do that to belittle those birds.
No.
I think they're probably the most valuable birds we have of the 1,000 or so that we have in the States. But in my mind, they're not raptors, but I love the conversation.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so,
and how different is that than anything else that science is inquiring, studying, and debating about? And that's what I think is most important, and maybe retrospectively where we've dropped the ball in conservation in referring to science, right? Because science is a process, and it's an evolving process that experiments that tend to reveal the same outcomes. That's what we would refer to as the science, right? But the scientific process, your methodologies could be wrong. Your experiment could be devised wrong. I mean, there's, it's like, saying, and again, I use metaphors and analogies all the time to communicate because I think it's easier to do with varying levels of people's backgrounds and knowledge. Is that it's like saying, would you take any one inning out of Major League Baseball in a year and say that is baseball? Because it might be a poor representation of a game, of the game in one inning. It might be horrible. There might be no hits in the game. There might be no exchanges of bases or stolen bases or outs or anything. It just, I mean, would you say that is baseball? Well, it is baseball, but is it baseball? And I think the
yeah.
same thing has to be said about science, that there are scientific findings or outcomes from experiments that are practicing in science, but would you say that is the science in the subject matter? No, not until
Well,
it's repeated with the same outcome. And then that's where I say a scientific truth, right? What we know today, another example is looking back when people were separating birds based on their morphology, based on how they look, how they live, what they eat, etc. Well, that was the science of the day, but now we have genetics. And actually, what I find fascinating is that the clades of animals being separated based on morphology was pretty damned accurate compared to today's genetic studies, which the genetic study is like the true fabric of the origin of these species and which family trees they're in. And so it's an ever evolving wonderland of potential knowledge and refined understandings, but there is no one truth other than
Well,
we're
and
always
it,
looking for it.
and it's interesting because you and I were raised at a similar time in a similar part of the world, and we were taught that there is a truth. And I am not a scientist and I'm not a judge, although I studied marine biology as a young man. That's where I thought I was going to go. And through a quirk of the world, I wound up being the youngest judge in history of the state of California. I think I was 16 years old and I was a judge in Ventura County. Story for another podcast.
Wow, yes.
But that being said, you look now today, and with all the information that's out there and all the different channels that it can be communicated by, right? Radio and TV and podcasts and social media and whatnot. And you brought up the point earlier, I can pick any controversial issue in this country, not just conservation related, not just raptor, but any controversial issue. And I can find well-credentialed experts on both sides that are 100% adamant that today is Tuesday. And then I can find an equal number that are equally adamant that today is Wednesday.
Yep.
And I brought up the law because I used to believe as a young person that the law was the law and a judge's job was to interpret that law. But now, depending on the issue, you go judge shopping because some judges are going to interpret the law. I mean, we just openly say we have liberal judges and conservative judges. And so, oh my God, we got to go before a conservative judge. We're never going to win this case. It shouldn't ever matter.
Yeah.
The law is the law. And to your point, I understand that science shifts. I understand that we learn more, we gain more knowledge, we gain more experience, our equipment becomes better, technology becomes better, but it just doesn't seem it should be that difficult to come to an accepted truth. And since we have politicized truth, now that is, maybe we'll come back one day to where there's an accepted truth, but there's just not anymore. And so things that you and I might have grown up thinking were absolute facts or should be facts, now it's like, no, there is no climate change. Well, yes, there is climate change. No, it's not man-caused. Yes, it is man-caused. No, it can't be fixed. Yes, it can be fixed. And again, to your point, I can bring you 100 experts to take every one of those 6 positions.
You bet.
And well-credentialed from real university, not like from Fred's college. And so I think to your point, maybe about the lead bullets earlier, is at some point you just think, you know what? I just can't listen to it anymore. My dad shot lead. My grandfather shot lead. I'm pretty sure my great-great-grandfather shot lead. And you know what, son of a bitch? I'm going to shoot lead. And that's it. And I'm not, because a week from now, you're going to tell me, it's like eggs. Don't eat eggs, you'll die. Oh, well, my God, if you don't eat eggs, you will, and I don't know. Should I drink milk? Shouldn't I? Do I have a glass of wine every day? Don't I? And at some point, I think we just shut down. And I imagine the challenging and difficult part of your gig is to get people to listen and then act on what they hear.
You bet. And you hit on it. I'm glad you brought it back to the lead issue. And I hate to even call it the issue, except that it is. The way we succeed in conservation is by giving people an opportunity to inform their truth. And that is entirely different than saying, accept my truth, right? I'm more educated in this. And that doesn't mean I'm better. It just means I've studied it more. So trust me. The problem is trust. So our model of conservation is let us share with you more information. We're not going to tell you what to think. We're going to give you more to think about.
Well, that right away puts you in a distinct minority. If you're unwilling to tell me what to think, then what good are you? I mean, that's what people are supposed to do, is tell everybody else how to think. This is how I think. It means this is how you should think.
Right, right.
But I think what happens with your way, which I do believe is the right way, is we may not get immediate results. You may not see, lead bullet sales dropping 98% the month after you give a lecture. But it does seep in. If your son comes to you and says, hey, Dad, you know what? I know Dad and Grandpa and great-grandpa all did this, but maybe we could just try it this way. I think we'd be just as successful as hunters, maybe start a little twitch of a new tradition, and we might save a few birds and animals on the way.
You
And
got it.
I'm not, you know, and so, and that, by the way, in my view, that's what becomes a lasting change,
You hit it.
right?
You're taking words you're taking words right out of my mouth. That is sustainability. That is lasting, impactful change. And no,
Yeah.
it is not fast. And that's when I get into debates with other people in conservation where they say, "Well, we don't have time. We have to do this now. So we need to pass a law." I was like, "Okay, but realize you can pass a law and still fail because laws are made to guide our community members. But if they don't believe in it, it's not going to guide them effectively. So you can,
Yeah.
and this is my same statement with a young scientist, you can be right or you can be successful in conservation. And of course, the blending of the two is what you want, right? You want to have impacting change and lasting change
Yep.
that's informed by the science you produce. But that is what conservation is. Science alone is not conservation. And people who have heard me before are probably already anticipating what I'm going to say. I understand why I weigh 300 pounds. It's not because I don't understand the equation, right? I
Yeah.
eat, I consume more calories than I burn, period. That is it. That is the
You're not
science.
suggesting that your weight is your responsibility, are you?
Well, I've seemed to
Because
be the one
that's,
carrying it around.
yeah, we're gonna have to end the podcast now if you're gonna take personal responsibility for your actions and inaction.
Yeah,
And I think that sustainability thing, I'll tie it back a little bit. I owned a marketing firm for 35 years, and every once in a while we'd get a client really easy. We'd go into a first meeting, and the VP of marketing would say, "My God, you're just what we're looking for. We're going to give you all our business." And I'd go
right.
back and tell the staff, and they'd be excited. And I would say, "Don't get too excited. We're going to lose them in a year." And why would you say that? Because we got them too easily. We didn't earn it.
Yep,
You gotta, you gotta earn it for that sustainability. If you go out and you sweat blood to bring in a client or to affect change in the hunting community, the odds are pretty good you'll keep that client for a long time, or that change will last for a long time. And I think, I love your position on this. So tell me a couple of the other projects you have going on. Let's focus here in the States.
okay.
Tell me what you go, because I know you've got, what is it? You're working with a 100 different species in 65 different countries, or
Yeah,
some
yeah,
huge number of. But let's, if we can, let's. Although now, see, my producer's going to yell at me because we're picking up a lot of international viewers, and you say, "Oh my God, you can't discount them." I'm not
sure.
trying to do that. I'm just saying, talk to me about what's happening here in the country.
You bet. So Aplomado falcons, let's talk about them. The Aplomado falcon was gone. The northern Aplomado falcon was gone in the U.S. by the 50s, and I don't think there was enough data at the time to really understand why. And when you look, however, at what an Aplomado falcon needs to survive, they need grasslands. Okay, so the humans in North America, we know about grasslands because of things like fire or cattle production, because of the beef industry, right? Or intact ecosystems and landscapes relative to things like sage grouse. That's how we've come to understand the value of grasslands. And when you look back at the history of our management of grasslands, we haven't done all that great. And it wasn't, again, intentional to graze at a similar rate from the last year, but now you're in a drought. And now that grazing level of grazing on a landscape, because you don't have the water you need in the following season, now you have a type conversion of habitat. So now you have brush encroachment. And so here's a good example. If I'm talking to a rancher about Aplomado falcons, I go to where they are. And this isn't manipulative. It's just to say, have you seen pictures of when your family started ranching here of the vast expanses of grassland compared to today? What do you see? Brush encroachment. Weesach and mesquite invades those unstable habitat types and replaces and outcompetes the grass because of drought. Well, the drought's not something we can control. And I know that's another argument that people will have. Did we cause it? Didn't we cause it? All of that. But let's set that aside for a moment and say what we're talking about is a vast change in habitat where now you have brush and you have trees. When you have brush and you have trees, you change the ecosystem's suitability for species. Enter the great horned owl. Now that you have increased overstory and places for owls to roost, and owls are fantastic predators, and you have decreased grasslands and decreased grassland bird species that Aplomados eat, now you've decreased the amount of food available to the Aplomado, and you've decreased safe habitat by having brush encroachment and an increased number of one of their number one predators, which is the great horned owl. Now, in a normal system, a functioning system, you'll have big enough expanses of grasslands where there are fewer predators like great horned owls and more of the passerine species that the Aplomados eat, and they have this equilibrium between them. But if you get an overabundance of the predators that uniquely can specialize on these really goofy young, when Aplomados fledge and they leave their nest, which used to be a yucca plant, a yucca tree, basically, and they're on the ground fiddling about with a beetle or a grasshopper or something like that. Well, if that's in the eye shot of an owl early in the morning or late in the day, that owl is going to say, "Oh, hey, what's that? Oh, there's a bunch of food items down there not paying attention. I'm going to go eat them." I've oversimplified it for the sake of understanding the system, but that's how you explain it. And so for the rancher, now I've taken them into a deep dive about something in relationships about birds that they could care less about until you return it to, so we're interested in the Aplomado falcon. We're interested in functional ecosystems of grasslands. Aren't you? Yes, we are. Well, let's go and modify that habitat by removing the brush and promoting the resurgence or the repair of that system to grasslands, and we benefit one another. And we'll do it in a protected way through safe harbor. And safe harbor gives the assurances to the land manager, the landowner, that if they work with us on this, it'll ease some of the fears that they have for the northern Aplomado falcon being an endangered species. And so while working with us, it gives them some protections, and our goals are the same, to restore grasslands so that they can be used by domestic stock, native ungulates, and the Aplomado falcon. And so one predator-prey relationship of a predator that wasn't there before, and now it's there. And then different things that we can do, like providing safe nesting structures. We put up artificial nesting structures so that Aplomados can raise their young in a modified habitat, if you will, through this nest box that wouldn't be necessary if we had the yuccas there. But since the yuccas have been either burned out or the type conversion is now Weisach and mesquite, now we put up a structure. If we put up a structure in the middle of a Weisach and mesquite forest, those Aplomados, they're going to be successful in having young, and then they're going to fledge, and the owls are going to eat them. So we have to eliminate and deal with all those variables to improve the grassland ecosystem so that Aplomados do well, and the native and domestic ungulates can do well. So that's an example there. And you talk about landscape change and time. Holy smokes. Now we're talking about connectivity and vast areas of restoration, which is expensive to go in and mechanically cut and then spray all of those invasive species to get them knocked back so you can have grasslands again. Some people can't see that far into the future and say, okay, 5 to 10 years from now, with that steady work, we can see that goal. Well, that usually doesn't pencil out in the math, and that's where conservation organizations come in, and these foundations who are willing to support that and fund that, that's where it comes in. You notice the first thing I didn't say, was that that's where the government needs to come in. I think that ship has sailed. That people tend to forget that through donations, through groups like ours as a nonprofit, a 501c3, we oftentimes are funding over 70% or 50% at least of the work that's going on out there. We're not saying that the government has to do this and adding that burden to the government. And in this day and age, what better thing to say is look at the history that we have as an NGO of public-private partnership. Back to Condors for just a moment. We've invested 30 years in Condor Recovery at the Peregrine Fund. We've supplied 70% of the funding from the donations that we get. The American public doesn't know this. And this is a model, I think, for future and sustainable conservation. So that's what we're doing with Aplomados.
I think that's fantastic. And when we finish the podcast, I want to talk to you about the American public not knowing about it and what we might be able to do about that. But that being the case, yesterday I interviewed a gentleman, maybe you've met him in your work, Steve Metz, who's your equivalent at the Save the Redwoods League in Northern California. And when we talked about his model is very similar to yours. And he's got public and private partnerships, and he brings in the indigenous tribes, and he brings in the nonprofits, and he's doing all of these different things. And the idea is not we're just going to run around and beg for money from the state or federal government and then be, as the wind blows, we're going to build a relationship with people around the community and around the country. And like you said, then we can go out and fund these, because it's a lot like if you talk to, say, Elizabeth Gray over at National Audubon, right? And they talk a lot about ecotourism. Ecotourism is a great concept, and you and I love it, and it's a really neat thing. But if you're the guy that's down hunting, let's say raptors in South America to feed your family, and somebody comes in and sings a song about how valuable raptors are and how beautiful they are and historically significant, this and that, I don't give a shit. I got 3 kids I got to feed. But if you can come in and say, hey, you can turn this extra bedroom into an Airbnb, and we can have some birders come down, and you guys will make a boatload more money, and you can buy all the food you're going to need, you're going to get their attention. And to your point, if I can fund that transition, because I'm not going to go hungry, I'm not going to have my family go hungry during that transition time. When you're talking about that 5 years or 10 years it takes to get the grasslands back, I'm sorry, man, that's not going to be on my nickel. No, that'll be on our nickel, or at least 4 cents out of every nickel. And suddenly now you have my attention, because I can see this vision down the way. And I think that's where so many of these conservationists don't get it. They think it's purely altruistic, and that everybody should kumbaya and get on board, and it's rainbows and butterflies and unicorns. And it's not. In most cases, at some level, it's somebody's business decision. Right. And I think you said it. I think you said it perfectly earlier on. The farmers in the San Joaquin Valley, they don't want the condors to live or die. It's not that big of a deal to them either way. But if bringing them back is going to hinder their livelihood, and you hear this all the time from, I don't want endangered species in my area. I don't need the government coming in and telling me you can't do this anymore, you can't do that anymore. Get them out of here. And to your point, if you're going to lead the way, if you're going to be the right pulling guard, you're going to block, and I'm the running back, suddenly I'm a giant Chris Parish fan. I'm a huge Chris Parish fan, because I'm not getting my financial block knocked off because you love condors.
Exactly.
And we're a great country at pointing out what other people should pay for because I like it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And believe me, those, the empathy that you come to have while traveling in different countries. And again, I saw it from my own experience, right? I was a product of a single parent family on assisted living, while my mother was in school and I was striving to get a football scholarship to get the hell out of there. So I saw that poverty in the American version. And then I got to go to the Darien in Panama. And my God, was that humbling. Or, the slums of New Delhi, or some of these other communities. And man, I thought I had an understanding. But I think if we can have empathy for whomever the target audience is and go to where they are. And this isn't a touchy-feely thing of we just need to be compassionate and more. Well, maybe we do. But by God, if you want a partner, then act like it and be that partner. And don't waffle. Don't say, oh, we're all in it. And then, later on say, all right, now we got our foot in the door. Now we're going to slam it shut. That's not sustainable. And history and families will remember that. And by partnering with people, yes, it's slow, but it's lasting change. You said it earlier. And if you are just if you're viewed as an adversarial special interest, then it won't last. But I also see the value in the warring parties, if you will. And I'm not just talking political parties, but I think it's the whole game. The whole game is a part of what we have that's beautiful here, and you don't appreciate it until you go to some other countries. And you don't have to go to other countries to see the disparity of wealth or the disparity, hey, we're a 501c3. I'm not going to knock wealth, because it's these wealthy individuals who are funding a lot of our work. And so it's not that they don't want to do conservation. They just don't, they want it to be a good investment. And don't we all?
Yes, we do. If you discuss conservation purely from an altruistic point of view, it's easy to get college kids riled up and high school
Yep.
kids to draw posters and, all that. But if you don't factor in the economic component, to your point, you're not going to be successful long term. It's just not possible. So I've got to share with you, because I don't want to take up more of your, well, I've already taken more of your time than I promised. So I don't want to take up a lot more of your time than I promised. But I need to share this with you because of what you do and the raptors you work with and the passion that your people have for it. I've got a book coming out next year called Why We Love Birds. And in that book, I interviewed 52 of the top birders in the country and asked them a series of questions. And people you would know, the Scott Weidensalls and Ken Kaufmans and Pete Dunns and Debbie Shearwaters and Simon Montgomery's, fantastic people in the birding community. But what I found fascinating, and I didn't expect it, by the way, is I asked each of them the same 5 questions. And those questions included your spark bird, your favorite bird, and your nemesis bird. Those were 3 of them. And it was amazing. I'm just going to run through a couple and share them with you, how many people brought up raptors, far more than any other segment of birds.
Wow.
Sophie Osborne, who wrote a book called Feather Trails and did a lot of work with, and did a lot of work with condors. Her favorite bird, peregrine falcons. That is her favorite. Here's some of the spark birds that people mention: burrowing owls, snowy owls multiple times, northern pygmy, northern saw-whet, bald eagle. Favorite bird, Julie Brown over at the Hawk Migration Association, peregrine falcon. Carl Safina, the author of Alfie and Me about the eastern screech owl, peregrine falcon. And then you've got people like Pete Dunn, northern harrier, Elizabeth Gray at Audubon, bald eagle, Greg Miller from the Big Ear, northern hawk owl, Scott Weidensall, northern saw-whet. I mean, it goes on. And then this is amazing to me, the number of these talented, experienced 50 and 60-year birders. These are some of the nemesis birds that they have, birds that they haven't been able to see. It's hard for me to imagine that somebody like Scott Weidensall hasn't seen every bird. But here's a list: northern saw-whet, northern hawk. A couple people have great gray owls, gyrfalcon, flams, harpy eagle, boreal owl, and the stellar sea eagle. The escaped one up in Maine. But raptors just come up over and over and over again when people talk about favorites, or the bird that they want to see, or the bird that inspired them to get into birding. And I love all of that.
Yeah.
Because I just love raptors. So I have to ask you, did you have a spark bird? Is there a bird that motivated you to get into that part of the world? Or is there a raptor that motivated you to develop a relationship with the peregrine?
I'm going to disappoint a lot of people right now, Scott.
Hey, thanks for warning me.
Yeah, it's for me, I can be amazed, and I can tell you which species amaze me the most, but I'm cognizant enough to know it's because of what I know or don't know about them that inspires me. So it's not just, I don't think I know enough about all of the birds to say I have a spark bird or one that continues to drive me. I think raptors, as a general rule, do come up high in my personal interest or what inspires me, but I'm interested in the root reason of that. And if you look back in history, written history, whether it's literature or cave paintings, and you look at the history represented for humanity as far back as you can tell, raptors have always had a place. Why is that? Every major branch of our military, for example, here at home, has a raptor in it. Currencies around the world, if you go to the UAE, the Saker falcon is on their currency. So you look at the deities in Africa or in India, or go back even farther, and with the Egyptians and Horus, right? The falcon-headed god. There's a reason that we as humans are fascinated by raptors. And I think it's more innate than it is learned. And I think it's through everybody's personal experience. I hear people talking about, oh man, when I was a kid, we had bald eagles and then they disappeared and now they're coming back and there's tears in their eyes. And it's not just because of what they were taught as the bald eagle being the representative raptor of the United States. It's because of their own personal experience. And so there's something at our core that I think inspires us about raptors: masters of the sky, masters of stealth, masters of being an apex predator. Well, let's not forget that we too, as humans, are at the top of our food chain. So maybe it's a reverence for that, but I think it goes beyond that. Look at the Parsis and who use raptors and use well, back to your original, is a vulture a raptor, but the raptors are the ones, the vultures are the ones who consume their dead and take them to the heavens in their beliefs. So I think for me personally, there's not one spark bird because it's limited to my knowledge of them. But man, I'm fascinated right now with Merlins because a lot of people don't know the difference. They'll see a small falcon and think that's a kestrel. But when you see a Merlin fly across the prairie, that bird has a different demeanor about it than a kestrel. And the beautiful thing
Yeah.
is a kestrel is something every school kid can see, hopefully still in their school at the ball field, right? Or on the way to school on the bus or in your parents' car, you can see a kestrel, right? And I know there's some scares in certain communities about kestrels because they're not doing well everywhere. But if you can differentiate a kestrel uh, um, from a sharp shinned hawk or a kestrel from a merlin. Merlins, they really fascinate me right now because I don't know a lot about them. And when I see one and I see the difference in flight, I think, oh wow, look at that. That is a predator. That is a master of the
Yeah.
skies. But then again, I told you I just came off of 2.5 weeks of falconry trips and seeing a brown bird that one of our guys had who he just trapped in New Mexico, and seeing that bird fly on Hungarian partridge in Montana, mind you, and seeing that bird's innate ability to adapt to the hood comes off. He's now in this female, she's now in a vast grassland in northeast Montana and quickly assesses the scene and is excited by seeing that dog on point and the resulting flush of a Hungarian partridge and takes flight after it. I'm fascinated by the relationships that critters have with the landscape, and I'm equally fascinated about our relationship with the landscape. And I want to figure out how we can merge those two together so that it's better than we left it, simply put. And I know that's really vague, but that's my fascination with wildlife, and that extends to I'm going to Arizona during Thanksgiving, and I have a bull tag, a bull elk tag. And I'm not excited about just going to kill a bull elk. I'm excited about being out there and having the opportunity and the luxury that it is that we still are able to hunt all of these different species. But I'm excited for the experience and what I'll learn from it. And yes, if I can fill the freezer because my family and I covet that protein, that'll be great. But it's the relationship we have with the living world and what we learn and how we pass that along that inspires me, not just an individual species. And so that's where I say, you know, for some of the listeners, maybe I'll disappoint them that it's not, the peregrine falcon because I work for the Peregrine Fund. That's a bit cliche. I am blown away by peregrine falcons and the story of the recovery of the peregrine falcon because of what it symbolizes as our potential to move forward. Tells us yet again we can better understand the system and we can take actions as a society that make for a better habitat and a better environment for all of these critters. That's what excites me.
Well, and I think that's fantastic. And I would like to think members of the audience would not be disappointed that you're candid about, your views and likes and dislikes. It doesn't impact the effort that you make. And I got to tell you, I'm not a hunter. Don't care one way or the other whether somebody is or not. I grew up in the exact opposite world that you did, although only 50 miles apart. I didn't know
Yeah.
anybody that was a hunter.
Wow.
But that being said, and I will tell you, by the way, people do not believe this. I am 68 years old. I moved to South Carolina 5.5 years ago, and I became a birder after I moved out here. I grew up in Southern California in Ventura County. I was fairly active. I one time went camping for 6 months straight. I mean, I was an outdoorsman and a naturalist, and I enjoyed birds. I never met a single person who was a birder, not one. Now, I probably met people who were birders, but it never came up. Never was there a discussion where I said, I'm a tennis player and, I'm a bowler and I'm a hunter. I'm a birder. Never once came up, which is just fascinating to me. And, I don't know. I guess It's just a different world for all of us. I will tell you, as you're going down for the elk, I was in Rocky Mountain National Park in September for the rutting season because I'm writing a book about mammals. And so I got to go watch the rut for a few days and see these things. I'll throw a picture up here and I'll send you a couple separately, but just magnificent, magnificent animals. And I just have to share, because we're talking about raptors, we're recording this on a Wednesday, and on Monday, 2 days ago, I went hiking with my son and my brother and my sister-in-law, just about a half hour from here. There's a place called Star Fort Pond, and we went on about a 2-hour hike. And at the end of the hike, I'd waited the whole hike because I knew we were coming to this field where in the winter, we usually get a northern harrier that comes in. I think northern harriers are magnificent. Matter of fact, I think northern harriers on one side and short-eared owls on the other are the bridge between owls and diurnals. That they're so
Yeah, yeah.
similar.
The
They're
cirques and
yeah, they're just the hunting patterns anyway. And sure enough, that northern harrier was there, and it was quartering this field that it hopefully it's the same one, but it comes to every winter. And I texted a couple of my local friends, being friends, they're like, "Oh my God, he's back! It's the first sighting of the year." And I could sit and watch. I've got a buddy coming out here from Arizona in about 2 weeks, and we've done this before when he's come out for the winter. We go out to this field and we will bring a little bit of bourbon and a couple of comfortable chairs and a couple cigars and our cameras, and we sit and watch that field and watch for that harrier for 3 hours.
that's
And
great.
it is. And then on the way home, my son was with me. We saw a red-shouldered hawk take a bird out of a tree, came firing across. We were on a dirt road and swept a bird out of a tree. And then the last thing we saw as we pulled up to the house was a bald eagle was circling the house.
There
And
you
I'm
go.
thinking, you know what? That's a day for me. That's a not that all the other things weren't great to see,
Yep.
but in my mind, racking up those raptors, that's just one hell of a day. Anyway, that being said, I'm going to throw my email up here. If anybody's got any questions that they want to send me, I'm happy to answer them. Any comments. If you've got any for Chris, send them to me and I'll get them over to Chris. And, we'll see if we can't open some more eyes maybe and make people aware of some of the stuff that's going on. But in the meantime, Chris, we talked before, I like to close the shows by asking my guests to recommend a book, something nature-based, but anything nature-based that they think the audience might enjoy. So if you would do that, that would be fantastic.
You bet. Well, I think I was asked this at the end of our last guest we had up in Montana at Hawking Camp. And I think by far and away, whether you're an avid reader or well-read or not, and whether or not you have the opportunity to share it with young people, that my side of the mountain it captures everything of the grandeur of the world that's out there and finding our place in it. And yeah, I think that's still one of my favorites.
Okay. Well, there'll be a picture of that up now as you're saying that. We'll throw that up on screen so people can take a look at it. The problem for me in doing this is that so many of the books that my guests have recommended sound great, and I haven't read them, but I ordered them, and so my nightstand is about to collapse from the books. Either that my guests have recommended or that they've written, whichever way that goes. So that's an interesting thing. Hey, for the audience, thank you so much for listening to us. If you're on Apple or Spotify or whatever it is, we appreciate it. If you happen to be watching us on YouTube, which is great if you are, and that is appreciated as well, do me a favor and hit subscribe. And the reason I ask you to do that is twofold. Number one, the more people we can get the message, like the message Chris has shared in the last hour, just the better off we're going to be as a society. Just the more people that understand conservation and what we can do is fantastic. And it allows us to bring in other guests as well. So it's a neat combination, no cost involved. As you've noticed, you've been here, no advertising on the show. It's just a chance to, frankly, it's my selfish chance to just talk to some great people. If I just called Chris out of the blue and said, "Hey, do you have 90 minutes? Can we bullshit for a while?" I might not have got him, but if I promise him some kind of audience and stuff, then I can get him to join me for a bit. So that comes out fantastic. But yeah, hit it, leave a comment, hit like, but please subscribe. And after this, as we always do, Chris, I don't know if you've had a chance to watch this, but at the end of each podcast, I then go do about an 8 or 10 minute segment on one animal or park or plant or
Cool.
whatever. Just something that's kind of intrigued me, and I get a chance to do that. And then the last thing I do at the end of every show, number one, of course, is to thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. I know you're busy and I appreciate you taking the time. And hopefully people are enjoying the message that you've shared with them over the course of this. I encourage everybody to get outside as much as they're able. And when you're out there, stay safe and stay curious. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Scott.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Field Notes. I'm your host, Scott Harris, and regular listeners know this is just a fun little thing I do at the end of every podcast. So I was trying to figure out what to do this Field Notes on. It's my little bit, so I get to pick it. I'm thinking, well, let's have some fun. Let's look at an insect. There's a lot of insects out there, and then I got to thinking, how many insects? Well, let me help you out there. Just in the U.S., there are close to 100,000 known species, if you will, scientifically documented species. But in addition to that, there are about 75,000 species that have been found and that we're aware of, but they have not gone through any kind of scientific backing. They've not been researched fully. So they are known as not described. They exist, they're there, we're aware of them, but nobody's done their PhD on them yet. So that's kind of a cool thing. One day they will go through that process. Of those, approximately 25,000 are beetles. I don't know why, but I was intrigued by beetles. So we have 25,000 beetle species here in the United States. And I decided, based on just an in-depth look at all 25,000 beetle species, which took forever. Actually, of course, I didn't do that. I just did some research and said, hey, what are some fun beetles? And the one that I came to a conclusion that I wanted to talk about today is the Bombadier beetle, which starts off with a cool name. Now, if you don't know anything about it, we are on the same page, but hopefully that will change in the next 5 minutes or so. Now, a Bombadier beetle grows to a maximum about a half inch in length, so they're not a huge beetle. They don't weigh anything. It is estimated that they weigh a few grains of salt, or 1/1000th of the weight of a paperclip. That's just remarkable. Now, here's where they get to be fun, because a lot of insects are small and don't weigh anything. When they are threatened, they eject a noxious, boiling spray. When I say boiling, I mean it gets up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And they fire this thing at whatever is threatening them. Now, the mixture itself is hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide. The Bombadier beetle stores these in two separate chambers in its body, and when it is threatened, it mixes them in a special chamber. It has to be special to withstand the heat, but it mixes these, creates this noxious liquid, and fires it out. Now, when it fires it out up to 500 times per second. It's a little machine gun, and it can rotate the nozzle and shoot in any direction, under its belly, left, right, straight, forward. It's everything. It's an amazing little tool. And on a per whatever basis, however you would do the relationship, it is 2 to 3 times more powerful than a small caliber bullet. So pretty cool. So I got to wondering, well, what then would attack a Bombadier beetle? Who would attack something like that? Ants do. And the Bombadier beetle, the first couple of ants that come in, will fire at them, boil their head off, and the other ants say, this isn't cool, and they take off. Spiders, if a spider attacks a Bombadier beetle, the odds are it's going to get killed. Frogs and toads have been known to swallow them and then turn around and spit it right back out. And small birds, which can survive getting shot by a Bombadier beetle, generally learn and only do this once. It is not something you want to have done a second time. They are estimated to be 150 years old, and that there are roughly 500 Bombadier beetle species scattered around the world in 6 continents. And as you almost always say when you talk about an animal being on 6 continents, it's not in Antarctica. As a matter of fact, I don't think, well, there isn't an animal that's on 6 continents, including Antarctica. So it's one of those. They are spread all over. There are 120 to 150 Bombadier beetle species in North America. They are most commonly found in the Midwest, throughout the Great Plains, and down into the Southwest. If you're curious, Bombadier beetles represent 25% of the total species, but only 10% of the population numbers, because so many of the smaller insects, like ants, for example, just have so many in raw numbers. Now, again, I was trying to understand what raw numbers mean. In the United States, we average about 400 million insects per acre. 400 million insects per acre. Now, to give you an idea, we have a country with about 350 million people, the entire country. Insects are larger than that on a per acre basis. The estimates, and they're just loose estimates that people don't really fully understand. I checked a number of sites, but somewhere between a quadrillion and less than 100 quadrillion. Now, what does a quadrillion mean? Sounds like one of those little numbers that a kid would make up, right? Like a bazillion. But a quadrillion is an actual number. It is a 1 followed by 15 zeros. To give you an idea, a billion is a 1 followed by 9 zeros, and a trillion is 1 followed by 12 zeros. We've talked about what tries to eat a beetle once, but what do beetles eat? They actually turn around and they eat ants. They love ants. They love aphids. They're nocturnal, so they're doing their hunting at night. But in addition to ants and aphids, they will eat caterpillars and they will eat beetle larvae. They also will scavenge. And so they're pretty important to the environment in that they are out there keeping the insect population down so that we don't get up to 450 million per acre. I don't know what the number would be, but nonetheless, it's pretty cool. So this has been my first field notes on an insect, but it will not be my last. I just found this fascinating, and I hope you did too. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe you're motivated to poke around and read a little bit more about Bombardier beetles. But either way, thank you for listening. If you're listening to the podcast on Apple or Spotify or any of the traditional platforms, very much appreciated. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube, do me a favor, reach over and click subscribe. 2 reasons for that. Number 1, every time somebody subscribes, YouTube pushes us out to more people, and just more people are hearing the message, and it makes it easier to invite in more guests. So that's kind of cool. And while you're there, drop a comment or click like. Just something. It helps the show out. I very much appreciate it and would consider it a favor. And the last thing, and I do this at the end of every broadcast, is if you're outside in nature, whether you're just on your back patio or hiking around a local park or doing some kind of worldwide tour, whatever it is, get outside, stay safe, and stay curious. Thanks for listening. And on behalf of the Bombardier beetles, we really appreciate you learning about us. Bye now.